And it is a particular pleasure for me to introduce David Schieber, one of our assistant professors of instruction. It was about 15 years ago, I think, that David, as a Northwestern undergraduate, appeared at my office, hoping to learn how to conduct sociological research. And as David will recall, and I hope I'm recalling correctly, we selected a really marvelous topic. We wanted to learn during the Depression, how did rumors about bank closures affect community sentiment? You remember that project? And so I sent David out to visit dusty small towns throughout the state of Illinois, where there were bank failures, searching through libraries and historical societies and other sites in those small towns. Well, as often happens, and as you graduate students are learning, and we faculty members have learned, that we must accept as part of scholarly life that things don't always go as planned. And David found little that spoke to our concern. And so it's my fault. But I wanted to remind you that some brilliant research ideas, those brilliant research ideas that you have, they may not come to pass. But David and I pressed on, and in time, with the help of Al Hunter, we published an essay on how alcohol came to what you all know as Heavenston. It was just a fairly short number of years ago that you could get a drink in Evanston, and now we are told by the Surgeon General that we were better off in the old days before you could get a drink. Well, after graduating from Northwestern with honors in sociology, David was admitted into UCLA's sociology department, where he wrote his dissertation on careers and cultures in adult films. Those of you who have younger siblings will probably realize that when you can't get into the home bathroom and it's locked, that they may be doing the same kind of research. At any rate, David has over the years published in Social Problems, in Socius, and in Qualitative Sociology. And I think we were truly fortunate to be able to hire David for the position that Charlie Moscos and that Craig Rawlings had previously filled, that is, teaching Introduction to Sociology as a form of charismatic display. Before giving David the stage, let me also note that he twice, not once, but twice received first place at the annual pie baking contest at UCLA's sociology department. And it is a tradition that I encourage this department to emulate. Well, I turn the floor over to my student and our colleague, David Schieber, presenting the sociology of autism.
Thank you so much, Gary. Thank you everyone for being here. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to speak in front of this group. It's hard to overstate the number of fantastic scholars, fantastic research I've seen. I took Bruce Crowther's economic sociology class in this room. I've done all sorts of stuff in this room. So it's very exciting to be up here speaking. Where is this all coming from? And like most, or well, like some things, this is coming from my own kind of need to procrastinate grading. And this is a real story. So a few years ago, I was grading real assignments from Introduction to Sociology, and I was reading one about a student talking about their process of getting diagnosed with autism. And it was in response to a Peter Conrad piece I assigned on the social construction of health and illness. And he's like, yeah, like I had some guesses. I took all these online autism quizzes, like it pointed me in this direction. I found this hashtag, actually autistic. A couple years later, I have a diagnosis, and lo and behold, I'm autistic. And I said, wow, kids these days with their autism, what is going on? So as you know, I don't want to keep on grading, I guess. So I pull up my browser and I find these online autism quizzes. And lo and behold, I score very, very well on them. So I say, well, okay, what is this, actually autistic hashtag that the student's talking about? And then I go down the rabbit hole and I start reading, and then, that essentially brings us here to today where I'm speaking to you. So, methodology. So in terms of where I want to go with this, has anyone read this book, Neurotribes? Yeah, Christine. So this is a fantastic book. It's by the author Steve Silberman. He's a journalist who's written about a number of scientists. He just passed away in August. That's the thing. He's treated as this founding person of what's become known as the neurodiversity movement. And the best way I can describe this book is essentially it's like the social history of American medicine by Paul Starr, but as applied to autism. Essentially looking at it from its early days as childhood schizophrenia, which we'll get into in a second, described by Asperger's in Nazi Germany as like, oh no, there's a separate category of Asperger's, and just kind of getting into this historical legacy of what we're actually talking about. And this is a fantastic starting point if you want to get into what is going on with this entire discussion. But here we go. In the 1990s, the United States saw a significant rise in the number of people being diagnosed with autism, a cognitive disability that impairs social and language skills, often causing those who have it to cling to repetitive routines and struggle to form relationships. Researchers attempted to attribute this spike in diagnosis to a number of culprits, most infamously and wrongly to vaccines. And I cannot emphasize that enough. But the simplest explanation is perhaps the strongest. Until the 1990s, autism diagnoses were rare because in the US, people with autism had been kept largely invisible. And that's quite the claim. That there are hidden populations of autistic individuals that have always existed, but have somehow been kept invisible. So where's this going? And this is an article with an interview with Steve Silberman before I passed away. I mean, this is 2017. He passed away in 2024. But the autism diagnosis didn't exist until the 1940s. And in the first half of the 20th century, the condition was typically misdiagnosed as childhood schizophrenia. Even after autism had been properly identified, clinicians blamed patients' parents for not showing their children enough love. It was thought to be a socialization problem. The most common treatment was to have the autistic person institutionalized, out of sight, and often cut off from family members, allegedly for his or her own good. And the diagnosis remained exceedingly rare. Most autistic people, and this is a big claim by Steve Silberman, particularly those with milder traits, less visible traits, if we want to use the language of like Irving Goffman, simply managed as best they could in a society that considered them very odd or eccentric. So once again, we have some big claims going on. And where this started off was in 2001, Steve Silberman essentially was having conversations, and here's the description, with individuals in Silicon Valley looking to do a journalism project on like tech bros essentially in Silicon Valley, and autism came up. So in 2001, 24 years ago at this point, Steve Silberman, then head science writer for Wired magazine, was working on an article about two leading figures at tech companies that he had learned both had autistic children. He was talking to a friend over lunch about this seemingly unusual coincidence when a woman at the next table overheard and told him there's an epidemic of autism in the high-tech world of Silicon Valley. Silberman did some research and found there was indeed a high incidence of autism in the area. In his experience interviewing tech workers at Google, Microsoft, and Apple, he had noticed that many of them exhibited autistic traits, difficulty reading body language and facial expressions, for example. So now we have something interesting happening. We're seeing, are these clusters of autism? Is this a particular population? Clusters of diagnoses? There's all sorts of literature out there on, is this a social contagion problem of like, oh, people just learn about this and apply labels to themselves. But this was the original 2001 article that created this essential firestorm, and has been debated, in the years since. But it was called the geek syndrome, autism and its milder cousin, Asperger's. This was published well before the creation of autism spectrum disorder in 2013, is surging among the children of Silicon Valley. Are math and tech genes to blame? And this, there's a very uncomfortable kind of tricky line that you have to balance when you do this type of research. There's a lot of individuals that almost take on this, like, I almost describe it as like autism superiority complex. Like, oh my gosh, look how, like, especially in Asperger's type communities, which I don't like. But I feel like this was this kind of first inkling of that type of stuff being published. So these days, the autistic fascinations with typology, ordered systems, visual modes of thinking, and subversive creativity have plenty of outlets. There's even a cheeky Asperger's term for the rest of us, neurotypicals. Many children on the spectrum become obsessed with VCRs, Pokemon, and computer games, working the joysticks until blisters appear on their fingers. In the diagnostic lexicon, this kind of relentless behavior is called perseveration, even when playing alongside someone their own age. However, autistic kids tend to play separately. Echoing Asperger, the director of the clinic in San Jose where I met Nick, Michelle Garcia Winner, suggests that Pokemon must have been invented by a team of Japanese engineers with Asperger's. Atwood writes that computers are an ideal interest for a person with Asperger's syndrome. But this was not, taken for granted, and it was not assumed that this was the correct, or at least a correct approach to understanding autism. So here's another article published in 2007, 6 years later in Scientific American, that very much describes autism through a different lens. So before we explore this question, a bit of background is in order. Autism is a severe disorder that first appears in infancy. Individuals with autism are characterized by problems in language, social bonding, and imagination. All suffer, and that's strong language, all suffer from serious communication deficits, and some are mute. They do not establish coastal relationships with others, preferring to remain in their own mental words. They engage in highly stereotyped and repetitive activities, exhibiting a marked aversion to change. About 2/3 of autistic individuals are mentally, and I'm using the term there, retarded. For reasons that are unknown, most are male, which is not true, and we'll get into it in a second. But this is the type of context that these articles are being published, and it's hard to imagine that this was not being published in direct response to Steve Silberman's work in Wired magazine. So since then, there's been some academic research on autism that I like in sociology that I'm okay with. So this is work by Kayat Liu, Marissa King, and Peter Behrman looking at the diffusion of autism diagnosis, specifically in California. Kayat Liu taught by stats sequence at UCLA, so I know Kayat. But this is the article. She published this, I assume, in graduate school at Columbia. But essentially what they show is that once someone, and through their social network analysis and through the clustering that they see, once someone in one of these social groups get diagnosed with autism, a lot of people do. And you can almost see the diffusion of diagnosis happening within clusters of these groups within California. One of the takeaways from this type of research that I've seen posited is like, oh, this is just like a cultural diffusion problem. Like, oh, people come up with new words and like, oh, and I see the exact same language used to describe things like trans, or like trans identities, gay identities, etc. But you're seeing that with autism as well. Another potential explanation is that these are actually clusters of autistic individuals that are finding new language to describe their own experiences, which is the side that I fall on and that we will get into throughout the talk today. There's some other work that's come out since then. This was in 2013, the same year that ASD was added to the DSM as the combined form instead of trying to pretend like you can differentiate between autism and Asperger's. They've combined it into an autism spectrum disorder in order to avoid the uncomfortable, lines of demarcation that don't really exist between the two diagnoses. And this has been explained by, I don't know, Skill Isle, last name, as a problem of professionalization, as professional authority. Essentially like, oh, as the doctors kind of have the ability to have the authority to make these diagnoses, you see increases of diagnosis happen. And this is really a problem of expertise. And one of my problems, and I'm not saying that's wrong, like, okay, fine, like you have professional expertise expanding and the domains they expand in increases diagnosis, et cetera. But nowhere in this literature is anyone talking about autism. In fact, when you look at all 780 citations of this literature, it's an entire literature of expertise with autism in this paper as its case. And there's in fact no descriptions of someone that actually has autism in this type of work. And then during the same time in 2013, once again, this is when autism spectrum disorder was added to the DSM-5. You see all sorts of discussions of like, well, what does this combination of categories mean? What about the people that want to keep them separate? There's an interesting push from within Asperger's communities against the creation of autism spectrum disorder as a single, diagnosis, in what I've read and my understanding of it, it seems like there's a lot of this pushback came from the more highly stigmatized label of autism, them knowing that it's more highly stigmatized and not wanting that label to then be added onto themselves. Like, Asperger's means high functioning. We don't want low functioning autism. When in fact, when you look at kind of what differentiates these two diagnoses, it's really malleable, and there's a lot of overlap between these. We essentially see folks diagnosed with Asperger's trying to push back against being included in the more stigmatized autism ASD label in 2013. And then you see some interesting work by Roy Grinker at George Mason University. And this is published in 2020. He's an anthropologist. This is anthropological work. But let's get rid of that. How do I get? That's autism, stigma, and disability, but I don't like that. That thing is covering up disability. But essentially, he makes this argument that, like, okay, well, if we look at some of Irving Goffman's work on stigma, that's one way, that's one lens through which you can kind of look at autism. But his argument, once again, is much more structural, doesn't actually talk or look at people that are diagnosed with autism, and essentially explains it as like, oh, well, autism exists because of structural capitalist logic. And for individuals that are unable to be productive within a capitalist regime, they become stigmatized for their inability to participate in that, in work. And for that reason, they become stigmatized. And it's in fact this, capitalist logic that creates this stigmatized context in which autistic individuals inhabit. Which once again, interesting, love it. Love that this stuff is being published and we're getting some here. We're getting, some interesting citations with stigma and stuff. But at the same time, it's not really doing it for me in terms of what's going on with autistic people. And then this is all now happening in a context where you can no longer take any of this for granted. So once again, Steve Silverman, here's a post he published August 21st, 2024 on the social network website Threads. He definitely wasn't on Twitter. He died 7 days later. This post was published August 21st. He died August 28th, 2024. But here's his post about Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's becoming the Health and Human Whatever Secretary. He gave My History of Autism Neurotribes the ultimate endorsement. In his book of Lies and BS about Anthony Fauci, he called my book the Manifesto of the Autism Rights Movement. I should be so lucky, but he meant it as an insult, dismissing the neurodiversity movement as just a cover of vaccine injury. And we're living in a very real context where this is a conversation that we're now having again, like vaccine, like Robert F. Kennedy with his nomination. Autism advocates fear a return to the dark age of explanations of, oh, this vaccine, whatever. And you have statements coming out from, Autism Science Federation. Today, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's continued to publicly promote the discredited theory that vaccines cause autism, met with President-elect Donald Trump in New York City, and afterwards stated that Mr. Trump has asked him to lead a new commission on vaccine safety and scientific integrity. Autism Science Foundation President Allison Singer released the following statement, saying that this is not a good thing. And while this, I'm not reading the entire. But this is also, happening in broader politics, but this is happening with our students as well. We're not the only ones happening. And for what it's worth, a lot of the stuff I'm talking about today, I've started including in lectures over the past 2 or 3 years. And it's only been good. And it's only brought up really, really fantastic conversations with students as I include this material in lectures. But here's Cedar, a student in Northwestern who I did not have as a student, but I met with them after reading this article because I thought it was a great article. We need to talk about autism. When I was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, shortly after I moved into my dorms in Northwestern my freshman year, I had no idea how to talk about it. For years of struggling with my mental health, I finally had a diagnosis that contextualized my entire experience, but it came with heavy stigma. I wondered if I should be open about my diagnosis or keep it secret. Through my conversations with other neurodivergent people, I've stopped seeing my autism as a private condition. My autism influences who I am, how I act, and the way I perceive the world. It is at the very core of my being. So as these broader conversations are happening at, the national level, we also need to be sensitive that these are conversations that our students are experiencing and seeing happening in front of them as well. So it's kind of this context that I'm trying to respond to today. And my intention today is to spend some time trying to make some sociological sense out of this seeming mess. What do we do with essentially the past 20, 30 years of whatever this is? So trajectory of today's talk. Let's get into it. First, I want to talk about, well, what exactly do we mean by autism? What is this word that we're using to describe some aspect of the human experience? Next, we'll get into, well, where does autism hide? If I'm making the argument, I believe Steve Silverman has on this thing. But if I believe that, then we should be able to find that. We should be able to find some of these hidden autistic individuals. Well, where do we look? Finally, and time permitting, we'll see what happens. We're going to talk a little bit about experience. Well, we'll get there, but experiencing autism at its intersections, and then we'll tie it up with, well, where do we go from here? So, what do we mean by autism? And this is a tricky question. And, this is the type of stuff that philosophers argue about, like categories of meaning and how we're describing aspects of the human experience using discrete labels. And these quickly become very muddled conversations to have. But this, and in this context, I am not a philosopher. But this is the book that one of my children's teachers showed up to parent-teacher conferences with to have a conversation. And this is a fantastic book. It's a book published by a few neuropsychologists, essentially talking about their experiences and describing what they look for when diagnosing autism with all of the current research in mind. This was published in 2023. 2023. So let's see what this book has to say. So what is autism? This is a challenging question to answer because our understanding of autism keeps evolving. If you had asked us 40 years ago when we were in high school what autism was, we likely would not have heard of it. If you had asked us 30 years ago when we were in graduate school, we probably would have talked about something along the lines of Dustin Hoffman's portrayal of Raymond in Rain Man. At that point, when many people, including healthcare providers and educators, thought of autism, they probably thought of white males with overtly odd behaviors who avoided eye contact and needed almost constant care and supervision, even if they had some special abilities. Sadly, some people in the general population still have this limited perception of autism, though awareness that other ways of being autistic are possible does seem to be growing. Our understanding of autism has, in fact, steadily expanded. And if you had asked us 20 years ago, we would have mentioned Asperger's, which included people who were autistic and also had average to well above average intelligence, and less obvious, or perhaps less disabling. And this is where we get into the interesting aspects of autism. Like, what do we mean by this? Like, it's a really interesting discussion of visible versus invisible traits and the ability of people to hide them. We probably still would have thought of a white male who was overtly quirky, if not downright odd, kind of like Sheldon from Big Bang Theory. While a bit more inclusive, this perception of autism is still held by countless people, including many healthcare professionals and educators. Thankfully, by the late 1990s, researchers and clinicians understood autism as a neurological difference that is largely genetic rather than psychological disorder caused by uncaring parents or so-called refrigerator mothers. Throughout a large portion of the 20th century, there was the blame of autism was placed on mothers, and specifically what were described as the uncaring, unemotional refrigerator mothers of autistic kids, which as we get into the, the expanded understanding that women as well as men can very well be autistic, this becomes a very, very dark accusation that was made throughout the 20th century. And then it goes on. So our understanding of autism has continued to expand rapidly. In recent years, if you had asked us a few years ago, we would have added the so-called female phenotype of autism, which is less externally obvious. These individuals do not fit our stereotypical idea of autism, but are nevertheless autistic. The idea of female phenotype autism taught us about the concept of camouflaging, sometimes called masking or passing as non-autistic. In recent years, a burst of research has focused on autistic females presenting in different, generally less obvious ways than autistic males. And many autistic females share their lived experience not only of being autistic, but also of their incredible difficulty getting an accurate diagnosis. Until relatively recently, it was assumed that autism, for all intents and purposes, did not exist amongst women, which is now rapidly becoming, people are realizing was never the case. From then, we learned that some autistics actively mask their autism, e.g. by effortfully making eye contact or by hiding their repetitive behaviors, and that we needed to look under the surface to see the autism. Autistic girls and women taught us about autistics who mask well, that they blend in, which makes it even harder for them to act with diagnosis and support. And I want to pause right there because first of all, we're discussing something that's fundamentally social. We're discussing a disorder that is focused on individuals that, for one reason or another, and we'll get into reasons, have difficulty making social connections, forming social relationships. But now we're also getting into individuals that realize this, but then very actively try to mask those characteristics in order to come across as non-autistic. And of course, sociology has language to speak to this. So here's Irving Goffman on Facework and analysis of the ritual elements of social interaction. And of course, if you get down to it, these are individuals that for one reason or another are having difficulty with the assumed norms of social interaction. And we don't need to get too much into Irving Goffman necessarily, because I'm not the first sociologist to necessarily make these connections. So if you're wondering why the talk today is called Sociology of Autism and not Toward a Sociology of Autism, it's because that title is already claimed by Jessica Nashia Simpson, who is a graduate student at Western Kentucky University, and this is her master's thesis. And she makes this really, it's good. I'm not going to say anything bad about this master's thesis. It's a fantastic, I love it. And she makes some really interesting comparisons to some symbolic interactionist literature. Essentially making this comparison to autism and the looking glass self, this idea that individuals are able to imagine the perceptions that others have of them and change their behavior in order to match those perceptions. And with autism, this can become difficult. So for Cooley, children develop a sense of self through their interactions with adults and peers. We believe through a three-step process, et cetera. For example, if we reflect on ourselves and believe that others would view us as unkempt, we may feel shame. Likewise, if we imagine someone viewing us speak in front of the class as competent and prepared, we're likely to feel feelings of pride. But Jessica Nashia Simpson makes the connection that there's something going on here in terms of the social difficulties that come with autism. And she makes this connection by describing, whether or not the legibility of social interaction, essentially. So Goffman emphasizes that we implicitly and explicitly announce our identities in a situation through our expressive behavior. And then Jessica Simpson makes an interesting comparison to Temple Grandin. I always liked when people use Temple Grandin as a comparison because no one argues whether or not Temple Grandin's autistic. There's this like, oh, well, is that person really autistic or not? Temple Grandin has been like the example of someone who's autistic for the past 30 years. For example, in the biographic film of Temple Grandin, Miss Grandin arrives on her aunt's farm and mentally takes note of a man. His boots, belt buckle, hats, spurs, and chaps are signals to her of the individual's identity. She exclaims, "Are you a cowboy?" She's scoffed at by others present, and her aunt quickly corrects her and changes the subject, implying that Temple has made a social faux pas. Why is this man not a cowboy? Like all the signs are there. This person is signaling that they're a cowboy, but of course, announcing that in front of a group is not socially, reasonable. And it's exactly that thing that ends up bringing, oh, well, you're socially awkward. This is an example of autism. You not understanding the social dynamics of a relationship. And there's some really interesting work coming out. This was published this past summer in 2024 in the Journal of American Folklore by Allison Stanich, who's a graduate student at Miami University. Graduate students have a better online profile than Allison Stanich, because I was able to find her LinkedIn Ho Writing Center profile. But this is her paper, All the World's a Neurotypical Stage, Neurodivergent Folklore, Autistic Masking, and Virtual Spaces for Discussing Autistic Identity. And she essentially describes this rise of masking language through the lens of folklore, essentially saying we're seeing this surge of individuals describing their own experiences using this language that they have available to them that's not yet really institutionalized. Once again, this is like, oh, the neuropsychologists are trying to convince people, are trying to get people to see that this exists. Well, the people in these autistic communities have already accepted this language as reasonable. So one such concept is masking, a conscious or subconscious act of suppressing neurodivergent traits in order to avoid stigma. focusing on autism, this article discusses masking as a performance of neurotypical identity, how this type of performance can lead to autistic burnout and prevent autistic people from being authentically autistic, and how social media has opened up spaces for discussions about masking, support, solidarity, and community. And through this lens, we almost see autistic masking being described through the lens of maybe another type of almost code switching, through the lens of almost a form of emotional labor that's ever present in everyday life that leads to some sort of burnout for individuals that have to take part in it. But there's some really interesting stuff going on here. But then this also begs the question, well, how do we think about individuals that don't see themselves as autistic, or maybe they do see themselves as autistic, but try to mask it? What happens to them? And I realize I'm speaking in the department of Howard Becker, so I wanted to make the connection. So if we look at outsiders, we can start thinking about, well, what are the labels that have historically been used for individuals? If they're avoiding the stigmatized label of autism, stigmatized label of Asperger's, well, what's going on? And this is just I always take screenshots of things I see on social media online. But I've seen this sentiment expressed quite a bit to those who have neurodivergent children and say they don't want to limit them by putting labels on them. Before I knew I was neurodivergent, my labels were stubborn, lazy, rebellious, difficult, stupid, flake, dumb, a list of very, very particular labels to apply to someone that can all be subsumed into this individual realizing that they're experiencing autism and ADHD, which is a much less, at least nowadays, a much less stigmatized way of describing one's self. So going back to the book, Is This Autism? A Guide for Clinicians and Everyone Else? I just want to highlight some of their key points that they're trying to make. With this in mind and focusing on verbal individuals with less obvious presentation of autism, we know that being autistic at its core means having a different type of nervous system. There's a genetic component to autism. People who have this different kind of nervous system experience, process, and respond to the world differently than non-autistics in a number of ways. This can include differences in experience of external sensations, noise, texture, their experience of internal sensations, hunger, thirst, pain, their movement patterns, stimming, self-stimulating dyspraxia, communication, having and preferring direct communication styles, and information processing, being more detail-oriented and less context-driven. These differences change over time, but are lifelong and pervasive. And these nervous system differences lead to multitudinous visible and invisible embodied experiences. And one name that we now have for these embodied experiences is autism spectrum disorder. And what you end up finding when you look in these spaces is just and I've heard it described as spiky, a spectrum, but just all sorts of characteristics that can come in any way, shape, or form, but often fall along some of these lines. So restricted interests, processing speed differences, sensory sensitivities, emotional dysregulation, executive dysfunction, different communication styles, and restricted eating. So that's what I mean by autism. But now I want to spend a little bit of time asking, well, where does autism hide and how can we find it? And once again, thinking back to this group of researcher at Columbia University's work, Kaya Liu et al., there's hypothetically clusters going on. Like we have some evidence of, social network clustering. Once someone realizes they have a diagnosis, everyone else gets diagnosed with the cluster. So where do we look? Where can we find some of these clusters of individuals? And I did look. I started, trying to see. But it's hard. And one of the reasons it's hard is because if you really want to get a good look at, past or, historical descriptions of autism, you would need to have someone who has spent the time writing about it or describing it. This is where Gary Fine comes in. So we have an individual in the room who spent, a good 40 years describing really, really particular social groups in really particular detail. And you can find some really interesting stuff should you decide to reread some of this work. So most observers agree that the community found in voluntary social worlds has numerous social benefits, preventing alienation, isolation, depression. Whether we think about Dungeons and Dragons, in which oddball teams find companionship, decimating and matching ogres, mushrooming, in which oddball naturalists find companionship digging up the dirt, or self-taught art, in which oddball aesthetes find companionship visiting dilapidated shacks that others share one's values and behaviors is self-validating. And when you go back through some of this work, and this is Shared Fantasy, published in 1983, it's worth noting that Asperger's did not live but a twinkle in God's eye. It wasn't going to be announced for another decade. In 1994, we have some really interesting descriptions here. So speakers are careful to distinguish themselves and their friends from this accusation, the accusation of being they're the type of person who has a hard time getting along with other people. They're the type of person that tries to get other people to like them so much, a lot of times where they just have a hard time in life, period. Um, the belief in social skills deficiencies is congruent with the rhetoric of gaming society as a community that permits the acquisition of these traits. Whether a gamer believes that gaming provides a supportive atmosphere for the development of interpersonal skills, the impact of role-playing games in my life is more than kilos of correspondence, etc. The impact has been in the relationships I've made, the people I've met, the ideas shared. In many ways, my mind has been open. I tend to be a shy person in real life. I tend to keep my distance and try to look as inconspicuous as I can. Do you think gaming helps you overcome your shyness? Yeah, it does. It's a complete reversal. And here's another quote on page 16, Shared Fantasy. As described above, players see themselves as a little odd or deviant. They say they have difficulty interacting with others, particularly women. Gamers recognize that many of them do not have active social lives, even with other males. I know some people that are totally socially out of it. They don't have any real social life. They go to school, they do their work, they come home. Me, I used to be like that. This is what I've gotten out of wargaming and role-playing gaming a lot. My social life comes from my gaming life, which is a really interesting, description of a particular social group forming in 1983. And this falls pretty well in line with some of these modern 2023 arguments on what autism is. So here's one of what can autism actually look like. Well, more likely to connect with other autists. I tend to make really the best connections with other neurodivergent folks. I find anyone who hyper-focuses and loves immersive and direct conversation very easy to relate to. And then this is interesting. Emotional dysregulation getting in the way. You'd think that, well, and emotional dysregulation can take a lot of forms. When I was younger and a lot more sensory sensitive, my fight or flight response would usually activate in fight mode, which would often manifest itself as me physically or verbally or whatever was causing me stress, overstimulated, etc. So here's a fantastic article by Adler and Adler. And this is where it's like, I was born in 1989. Came out in 1992. And I think they're still in Colorado. They might be emeritus. I'm not sure. But 1992, Sociology of Education, socialization and gender roles, popularity among elementary school boys and girls. And that's an ethnography of essentially social hierarchies in an elementary school. So in contrast, boys who demonstrated effeminate behavior were referred to by the pejorative terms such as F-word, sissy, and homo, and consequently lost status. One boy was constantly derided behind his back because he got flustered easily, had a spaz. We call that emotional dysregulation now. Lost his temper, slammed things down on his desk, stomped around the classroom, and then would start to cry. Two fifth grade boys described a classmate they considered the prototypical F-word. So let's hear what elementary school kids thought fag was in 1992. Ren is such a nerd. He's short and his ears stick out. And then he sits in his chair. He crosses one leg over the other and curls the toe around his calf. So it's double crossed like this. It looks so faggy with his girly shoes. And he always sits up erect in perfect posture like this. And he's always raising his hand to get the teacher to call on him. Yeah, Ren is the kind of kid when the teacher has to go up for a minute, she says, I'm leaving Ren in charge. Well, I'm gone. And I just want to make the point, like that was, 1992. This is me, just wasting time on the internet in 2023. But this is the subreddit Aspie memes. It's an Asperger's subreddit, and it was created before the creation of autism spectrum disorder, hence the name. But someone making this cartoon, do you ever just stand and sit like this? A cartoon expressing exactly, like with the curls, the toe around the other calf, so it's double crossed. And you suddenly have comments of individuals being like, I know this is crazy. I finally don't feel weird for doing this. Everyone always says I say gay or like a woman. Which begs the question in my head, why are multiple generations of kids being bullied and called homophobic slurs for sitting like this? And when you start getting into like really like the folkloric knowledge that's emerging out of autism type spaces, there's explanations. There's all like when you start talking about the physical manifestations of autism, there's all sorts of things like joint things. And I'm saying things because it's so many different descriptions, but joint things, tummy, stomach issues, all sorts of stuff. But this idea that, some sitting more comfortably in a specific way that's somehow tied to autism, but also becomes the stigmatized way that these individuals get bullied and made fun of is very interesting to me. We can go on. So this is Gary's ethnography with the boys on Little League baseball teams, originally published in 1987. And there was a description in this book of a kid that was particularly unpopular on his Little League baseball team. So with these pre-adolescents probably could have provided specific examples of behavior. They expressed their attitudes to others in general terms, through even though their reference was specific, as in the following example. Terry Hayes, an 11-year-old on the Expos, is generally scorned for what others consider as immaturity and his social awkwardness. One Expo says that Terry is daffy. Another says he sucks. Brian Nash, the Expos 12-year-old starting catcher, mocks Terry, saying with spastic gestures, "I've got cerebral palsy." Harvey Gregg, another 11-year-old, says Hayes takes birth control pills, i.e. he is a girl. Thank you, Gary. None of the insults directed to Terry insulted particular behavior, but they all reflected a generalized stereotyped impression. I do once again. And like there's this kind of like, oh, what could we do? This kid's being bullied, but the kids are picking up on something. The kids don't get bullied out of nowhere. And I think it's interesting, why are so many of these insults towards these children expressing, and once again, emotional dysregulation, whatever, like all of these are really pejorative terms that are now subsumed into what would become a child that is probably going to go to occupational therapy and have some sort of intervention in order to make sure they're able to function in the classroom in a way that doesn't end up with them being made fun of by their peers. But why are so many of these insults towards these children focused on gender? Is it related to the now often noted co-occurrence of gender nonconformity with autism? And this is exactly the type of work that you've been seeing, and this was published in 2016, so coming out, over the past 5 to 10 years. So here's some sexual medicine reviews, gender dysphoria and autism spectrum disorder, a systematic review of the literature. But essentially making the argument that after going through whatever literature existed in 2016, there's a growing clinical recognition that a significant proportion of patients with gender dysphoria have concurrent autism spectrum disorder. And I would, I make the argument that you're seeing something similar happen here. When you go into this history of gender-based bullying, and the individuals that would be selected on as being, bullied in these ways, it would not surprise me if there's matching going on here. And I think it's really interesting to then start thinking about, well, and this is Gary's work on on the moral panic around Dungeons and Dragons being a site of Satanism in the 1980s, where it was targeted as being as part of the satanic panic. But once again, as I, work through all these books, all this literature, I start asking myself, who was this satanic panic targeting? Who are these clusters of individuals that were playing Dungeons and Dragons in the 1980s, perhaps expressing gender dysphoria as it would have been presented in the 1980s, perhaps expressing, eccentric oddities as it would have been in the 1980s. But then being targeted in a really, really particular way. And it's worth noting that this isn't necessarily gone. So here's Jordan Peterson says being trans is a contagion similar to satanic ritual abuse on the Joe Rogan podcast. When you get into it, when you start looking at accusations of Satanism in the public discourse, they are very, very, very often targeted towards individuals that are gender nonconforming. And especially, or social groups where gender nonconformity is treated as being a non-issue or as being okay. So another thing that comes up in this autism book is this idea that fandoms and intense interests can often be seen as sites of autistic inclusivity and community. So getting into it, and intense interest can be both good and bad. Grace's teachers always commented as she persistently read during class. Over the years, some Grace's teachers were not flexible and would reprimand her for not paying attention, even though she earned straight A's. It's about this idea of like intense interest in reading. Fast forward 10 years, Grace is still the youngest student in her PhD program. She still spends all her time reading, and it's great difficulty making friends, etc. But I'm getting into, and this is talking about like making an effort to describe the oftentimes historically ignored experience of women with autism. We also see girls who are intensely interested in pop culture. This can include famous people such as Taylor Swift. When you start getting into Swiftie subculture, you start seeing some things emerge. K-pop bands, particularly TV shows such as The Office. Some autistic girls become super fans who amass a tremendous amount of knowledge about their interests. Writing fan fiction might be one way they express this, while many others may share these interests. For them, they are generally far less intense. And interestingly enough, Gary's been theorizing about this. Gary writes a lot of books. A lot of it.
There must be a term for someone who writes too much without having enough to say.
Yeah. Well, I've been reading. I've been up in my office reading. I've been up there. But this recently came out. It's by MIT Press. 50 Years of Dungeons and Dragons. It's essentially an anthology talking about 50 year. It's the 50-year anniversary of Dungeons and Dragons. But Gary uses that as an opportunity to write a chapter of what he describes as soft communities. He describes these soft communities as essentially being communities that are focused on particular interests. And by being focused on a particular interest, create spaces for individuals who may, be ostracized in other spaces, but by being interested in that particular interest are accepted within these spaces. So as Gary says, this include some players may have revealed social deficits that made them problematic participants in other domains, but if they demonstrated a level of competence and enthusiasm at the game table, they were likely to be accepted despite their idiosyncratic behavior. This included talking too loud or too often, not sharing food, or being notably unhygienic. This openness defines a soft community, as is true for the longstanding communities of competitive chess, where individual members are acknowledged as sometimes behaving in ways that would be considered deviant in the larger world. So, of course, Gary wrote an ethnography of competitive chess players, and pawns. And you can find, and so here's the quote. So as one star high school player, star chess player commented, how the public views chess, it always ticks me off. There are small comments that I know people don't respect. The nerds here. There are a lot of people who would be really good at chess, but don't do chess because they think it's all a bunch of nerds. A lot of people are deterred from chess because the nerd stereotype. And then this image of chess transcends high school corridors. As Gary Kasparov remarked, good at chess usually means bad at life. Once again, we call that executive dysfunction now. The wife of an active player speaks of the magazines that he studies as geek porn. More to the point is the television reality show Beauty and the Geek, where 8 socially challenged male geeks were paired with female beauties. One geek was an active chess player. I'm not in cultural studies, maybe this literature already exists, but essentially what we're seeing, I would argue that what we're seeing described here is essentially autism exploitation genre. Of like, ooh, we can let's get all the nerds together and see what happens when they try to date the beautiful woman. But in my head, that's essentially what's happening. But we don't need to just rely on Gary for, our ethnographies of all of this. There's been some really interesting recent ethnographies done specifically focused on autistic kids. So this is a 2023 ethnography of how kids diagnosed with ASD use technology, is essentially trying to look at their relationships with screens. It was an N=60 and it oversampled low-income non-white children, which I like about it. That is not typical of this genre of research. But it gets into it. So virtual and in-person clubs and groups organized around specific media genres and franchises also allowed autistic teens to regularly connect with peers who had similar interests and under social conditions that they did not find overly taxing. When 13-year-old Adrian, white boy, was bouncing between schools during a turbulent period in his life, his mom, Brianna, said, Minecraft helped him get together with people. He wasn't sitting at school on a daily basis. He was also involved in a Scratch computer programming club and the local Boys and Girls Club. As long as your kid doesn't get beaten up in the other areas of the club, the tech room is pretty cool, Brianna said sardonically, alluding to Adrian's struggles with bullying. Beyond digital media, organized tabletop and card games also kept Adrian regularly connected with other kids. I have this thing called Pokemon League every Saturday, he said, which was a small group of teens that gathered weekly at a local gaming store to compete in a turn-based combat game with Pokemon trading cards. In general, Adrian reported that, honestly, I don't actually have many friends. I'm much more of an introvert. For his recent Dungeons and Dragons themed birthday party, he had 6 friends over to play the video game Super Smash Brothers. But other than that, I rarely have enough friends over here to actually like have fun having screen time and stuff. Adrian said, slightly mocking the adult-driven terminology for young people's media use, then getting into his involvement in Dungeons and Dragons groups. And this is another good, I like this ethnography too. It's by Elizabeth Fine, who's an associate professor in chair of psychology at Duquesne University, living on the spectrum, autism in youth and community. And what she did was essentially do an ethnography of an Asperger's camp, a camp that individuals, kids diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder are sent to or get sent to by their parents to like meet other kids with ASD and have fun. And our descriptions of this camp are interesting. So I heard these kinds of stories frequently, not only at the ASD camp, but also woven throughout the creative work in which youth on the spectrum seem so often to be engaged. In their art, their games, their informal creative practices, they often imagine themselves as half human and half demon, pierced by shards of evil swords or possessed by powerful ancestors, re-envisioning themselves as mutant hybrid creatures who contain a force they struggle to manage and control. In doing so, they draw on a shared folk mythology from fantasy literature, comic books, anime, role-playing games, and other such forms of speculative culture. I like that term, speculative culture. These stories are often organized around moral valences in tension with one another, light and dark, good and evil, in the context of negotiating power within social relationships. Naruto, for example, the anime and manga series that had Sylvester so captivated, tells the story of a young ninja in training who discovers, etc. But essentially all of these kind of particular interests that become sites of autistic inclusivity. And I even go as far as to say, and this is essentially an article by Elizabeth Fine that was published out of the ethnography I just showed you, but it was published in 2015. But you're seeing what Gary describes as soft communities essentially being used as therapeutic interventions, actively being used as therapeutic interventions for autistic kids. So every summer, a group of role-playing gamers gathers in an American town dressed up as moon goddesses, mad scientists, and other fantastical characters as they act out elaborate, improvised narratives of transformation, destruction, and redemption. And then she goes on to describe this as the journey folk and this kind of summer camp for autistic inclusion based on shared interests. So another question that came up as I was reading a lot of this stuff was, well, does intense and earnest commitment and devotion to a specific interest, like we see through some kind of autistic characteristics, over a period of time relate to something like authenticity? Another area that we've seen kind of some work being published. So this is Gary's ethnography of self-taught artists, Everyday Genius. And there's an interesting quote here as well. So on another occasion, a collector commented critically about a dealer who was selling work by an artist who lived under a bridge, noting she was pulling at our heartstrings. She was piquing curiosity. It was like selling tickets to a freak show. Her husband added, "We bought on emotion. The recognition of the manipulation did not prevent the dealer's strategy from working. Some collectors specialize in troubled domains, asking for work from specific pathologies, schizos or autistics." But this idea that like, oh, an individual has spent years being obsessively dedicated to this one single pursuit, at the expense of their entire, at the expense of everything else going on in their life, suddenly that's being treated as like, oh, well, that's an indication of authenticity. That's an indication of worth. And dealers take it. And this is one of these things that drives me crazy. It was published in 2004, when people are still like, vaccines cause autism. Like what, like, it's like, we can never, who's autism? And then like people get diagnosed with autism. It's like, you're not actually autistic. But then when it comes to the art dealers, they know exactly who's autistic. And they're very willing to take advantage of that in order to pump up the price. Oh, like you should see how big of a weirdo that artist is. You should definitely buy their work. And that ends up being a selling point for the art itself, which once again begs another question in my mind: how often is authenticity a euphemism for what we could also describe as autistic earnestness? Like, oh, that individual is obsessively interested in making the thing, and I have no idea. I like, oh, that person spent decades perfecting the single sushi bite that's perfect. That's an authentic experience. That's also a description of someone who is very, very particularly interested in the single pursuit. And then you can start thinking, well, do people take advantage of and profit off of what I would describe as this autistic earnestness. So we're doing not great on time. We'll get there. So let's start a little bit with experiencing autism at its intersections. So I do want to touch on autism and gender and autism and race. There's some interesting stuff with autism and beauty, but I put it in brackets because I'm not essentially everything I've read. It is extremely hard for conventionally attractive women to convince anyone that they're autistic. No one believes that until their relationships fall apart. And it's this like really interesting intersection of essentially individuals that like have a very difficult time convincing anyone that they're autistic. And it's interesting. But in terms of gender, there's been some really interesting connections people have made. That thing's in the way. But if you couldn't be labeled as autistic, if women couldn't be labeled as autistic until recently, which they couldn't, it was just treated as non-existent. What did they get labeled as historically is a question that I love to ask. And you see this bubbling up as almost folkloric knowledge in some of these online autism spaces. So this is another subreddit, Autism and Women, that's focused on women and their who have autism. But do any fellow autistics suffer from resting bitch face? I can tell when I stop masking and just relax my face, I look mean. And obviously I try to look friendlier because I become conscious of it, but then I end up masking. And once I get tired of masking, I have resting bitch face. It just cycles over and over. Yep, I usually get told that I have resting sad face. I came to see her, I think I have resting sad face. And then other descriptions, once again, getting into these labels that have historically been used to describe what we could probably describe as autistic experiences. She's bashful, she's shy, she's sensitive, she's blunt, she's abrupt. That's just how she is. I was chronically bullied at school in the 80s. I was only sensitive, socially awkward, and emotionally immature. Once again, the labels being used in the 1980s. My son, much more developmentally delayed and obviously different to his peers, was not bullied. The difference, my son was officially diagnosed as autistic age 5 and had support systems and staff in place. Autism and ADHD was a rarity for girls in the 70s and 80s. My son has grown up aware of his worth. I grew up self-hating and insecure. Tell me the diagnosis is a harmful label. But that's just to say there's some really interesting work coming out looking at autism through this gendered lens. This was a book by Jordan Jack, Autism and Gender, From Refrigerator Mothers to Computer Geeks, essentially thinking through, well, what is the language that has historically been used to describe women with autism if it wasn't the word autism. But you get into things like refrigerator mom, which has its own very particular history in the United States, resting bitch face, manic pixie dream girls, another one of these terms that people latch onto, bossy, rude, cold, stuck up. But all of these are extremely gendered, pejorative, can be pejorative gendered terms that at the end of the day very much describe what is close to being something like an autistic experience. And then I just want to also make the point that anyone can be autistic, and there are autistic individuals in every population. And there is some really dark answers to questions that you start asking once you start thinking about the experiences of, in particular, Black boys with autism in the United States. When you start thinking about, well, what happens when Black boys in the United States act blunt, abrupt, or emotionally explosive? The types of characteristics that can be associated with autism. And you end up with headlines like this. Body cam video shows a fatal shooting of a teen with autism as he approaches California deputy with a gardening tool. Of course, an individual that is fight or flight response, difficult. There's a trillion reasons why an autistic person would not do well in this type of situation. But when the person on the other end is assuming the worst about this person, instead of being empathetic and understanding that this person might be different in some way, you end up with horrible consequences. And that I wish I could get rid of it. I don't even know where my cursor is. But here, what was it like to be essentially an autistic Black kid who just questions social hierarchies? One of these things that's very common amongst autistic youth, but growing up in the Jim Crow South. And this is an article by Ronald Davis, who's a historian at Cal State Northridge, Racial Etiquette, talking about the racial customs and rules of racial behavior in Jim Crow America. But just to make the point that it would be horrible for an autistic, who just asks questions, who wonders about social hierarchy, why do we have to do it that way, to grow up in a system like this, it will not go well. And it's thinking about kind of the history of it is difficult, and I'm not even sure if I'm, the person to go that direction. But it is something worth speaking to. Even thinking about W.B. Du Bois and his thought of double consciousness, this idea of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity, and describing the experience of Black Americans in this context but then thinking of the intersection of like, oh, well, not only do you need to like essentially code switch to pretend to be whatever in front of white people during this time, you're also autistic on top of that, and you don't really get whatever social hierarchy, social relationships to begin with. This is a really tragic place for an individual person to be. So we're about out of time. There's some interesting work on vaccine hesitancy in minority populations and essentially reasons people become distrustful of the healthcare system. I also think this is some stuff I saw as I was doing this, kind of a logic within minority populations of like, well, if my child already has one stigmatized label, why would I choose to give them another? Why would I seek out a diagnosis that'll just stigmatize them further? Of course, that's a huge assumption. There's all sorts of like reasons people would find a diagnosis helpful. But this is, and for what it's worth, I'm pretty sure that this was my dad's logic growing up. He did not want a child with a stigmatized label. But when I was in high school, my doctor told my mom I had ADHD. My African mom said that is for white kids, not Khadijah. Years later, my child is diagnosed with autism and ADHD. They know their diagnosis and are supported. At 34, I was diagnosed with autism and ADHD, and I'm unmasked now. Then this comment, Black people get their autism diagnosed and tell their parents just for their parents to be like, yeah, they told us that when you were younger. But this idea that it's difficult to accept a label that you perceive as being stigmatized. So I want to finish up with just 3 quick takeaways before we have a little Q&A. So takeaway 1, I want to make the argument that autism is fundamentally sociological, and the field of symbolic interactionism in particular has the language to speak to the embodied experience of autism. You already see some people making these connections, but there's a lot more connections to be made, and it's an exciting way to kind of get at the socialness of autism spectrum disorder. I also want to stand firm and make the argument that there have, in fact, always been quote unquote hidden populations, communities, clusters of autistic folks centered around particular interests, skills, and hobbies. I would go as far to say that anthropologically, these clusters are a fundamental part of the human experience. When you think, like, I don't know, the history of Burgundy in France and the fact that it was the monks that created like the world's biggest wine classification system, it's like, who were these people doing this? It's a really particular thing that they were doing. And then takeaway 3 is anyone can be autistic, and autism does not have a look. And once you start assuming autism has a look, it creates really difficult experiences for individuals that try to use this terminology to describe their experiences and then get treated as not being serious. And that's why I really like the example of autism and beauty, this example of like conventionally attractive people just not being believed because it's like, you're too pretty to be autistic. That's not a kind thing to say to someone. And just making this point that anyone can be autistic and it does not have a look. Thank you so much. I went a little over time. Thank you. And I really appreciate having the opportunity.
David, thank you for letting me know what I've been doing for half a second. Christine, I think you're the first question.
David, thank you for such a great talk. I've been doing a lot of reading in this space. I have several relatives on the autism spectrum. And I think what you were pointing out and the threads you were putting in our sociological literature and with what is known about autism and with these experiences are really quite innovative and unique. And I hope you publish this somewhere because it is a perspective that is not out there. And it's really a beautiful weaving of our strengths in sociology and what, and all these examples from Gary's work and other ethnographies. I think it's just amazing. So I'm really excited.
Thank you. I appreciate
That's
it. That's not a question. Well, yeah. Well, this is where this stands now. We'll see if this turns into something bigger.
Yeah.
All right. I think yes.
Yeah. So what's your opinion about like so how are maybe the sociological definition of autism could be also applied to other mental disorders and the diagnosis of mental disorder?
Mm-hmm. Are you thinking of any in particular?
No, I feel like ADHD or depression.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, I'm talking about autism. Like that's what I'm doing with this talk, and still on over time. But this is happening in the context of like the neurodiversity movement, which is inclusive of all sorts of things. So including ADHD, there's all sorts, and you saw this kind of bubbling up in some of the kind of colloquial social media examples I gave. But there's an increasing recognition that there's a large overlap or comorbidity with autism and ADHD. That has been previously or historically ignored, and oftentimes the lines between the two can be somewhat blurred. And then there's this, and this is me. This is me just kind of spouting off on a stage. But I almost I've started to think of a lot of the other kind of psychiatric diagnoses as potential, like those are the adverse outcomes of someone not being supported as an autistic individual. So for an example, I don't. It's tricky to talk about because they are real diagnoses that are separate from autism, and I'm not trying to muddle everything and say like I don't want to. I'm sensitive to being criticized like trying to describe everything as autism. But when you start looking at things like borderline personality disorder, OCD, there's a few others. The depressions included. You can oftentimes look at these as being in some ways emergent from like, oh, like someone gets bullied for their inability to stop doing, like I had bit my nails for 30 years until I started painting my nails. And many people tried to get me to stop biting my nails, but then that becomes anxiety. That becomes a socially created anxiety as opposed to like something else, but that's emergent from, stimming, I guess. And not necessarily like, oh, you were born with the depression and that anyways, but that's my own perspective. Does that answer anything? I don't even know if I.
I think that's a good answer because you also mentioned some kind of personality disorders, which also connect to broad like umbrella term describing like maybe people that are different sort of like also depression, but not exactly following the umbrella term.
Yeah. No, and I think, and I'm really sensitive to like the entire, like I like the neurodiversity paradigm as like a social approach to these conditions, as opposed to like, cure it. But anyways.
Okay, Ryan, thank you. I think Santiago was next.
It's not fair, go.
Yeah, this was super interesting. I'm really excited about like where people like receive. So part of what I think Bill was showing is that not just like medical sociology that should be interested in like studying autism. It's like the cultural movement behind autism and ADHD awareness is like really something that begs like a lot of sociology. I was wondering if in what you're reading you've seen more over constructions not of autism but of neurotypicality. Like I think there's a lot of times like this contrast, like, neurodivergent versus the neurotypical, and you see this in like technology.
Yeah.
Like, one person's going to do this, but it's strange to think of what exactly a neurotypical person is and what they would represent. And so I was wondering if you've seen
and for what it's worth, I've certainly seen that, and I know exactly what you're talking about. This like kind of like tit for tat, like oh, like neurotypicals versus neurodivergent. I don't like it. I think it's I think anytime individuals start separating themselves out like that, there's oftentimes particular, as I mentioned, one of like the most famous person that describes themselves as autistic right now probably is Elon Musk. But it comes from this perspective of like this almost like eugenicist autism superiority type approach of like, oh, well, we're better than other people. And I'm not making that up. If you wanted me to put together on Elon Musk saying this, I could make that slide deck. But it's just it's a pretty in my head, it's a pretty kind of toxic approach to viewing these types of relationships. And this like, oh, well, actually, autistic people are more advanced than what we do. That's not, and then like even we need to go back 1,000 slides, but like the spectrumness of it all. Like that's why this is such a useful kind of descriptive tool. And why I love the change of autism spectrum disorder. I think this is an incredibly useful tool because it does describe kind of the spikiness of this all. And like what is the line where someone goes from, typical to atypical? It's like, well, is it like I don't like getting my blood drawn. Like that's a sensory sensitivity, but no one likes getting their blood drawn. It's like I pass out when I get my blood drawn. It's like it's an entire thing. I've like had a shoulder injury because it's a lot. But like at what point do you draw the line of like, no, it goes from like something no one else likes to like a thing that and I've never been diagnosed. And they're like it's interesting. So yeah, and it's really one of my favorite quotes I remember reading at some point with someone describing their experience with autism and being like, I'm never autistic when I'm alone. Like I'm only autistic when I leave my room. But it's this idea that autism is fundamentally social, and it's not until other people start making judgments of behavior that someone becomes described as different, which is why this stigma language is really useful in my head to kind of use as a crutch to describe this. Yeah, I don't, is that answering anything? I can ramble forever.
Yeah, I just think it's hard to construct like leaving category when people are still trying to also understand like especially with the movement, it's like neurodivergence, it's like and it's more inclusive,
Yeah.
increasingly, right? And so how do you single out somebody who's more neurotypical? And I don't know, like I've had discussions with my partner about, okay, well, what would that look like?
Yeah.
Who do we know who is like neurotypical, like who doesn't demonstrate?
Well, that's the thing, and it is like it's
something like, you know.
and like I feel that like it's like, oh, are we getting into this world of like everyone's autistic, like everyone can fit somewhere along this spectrum, but then also you like, but there's the kid getting bullied for gender dysphoria in the school, and like there's like that kid like that needs support because they're going through a horrible experience. It's like, well, that like we have a label for that, and we can like with that label we can get them support. So they're like that, and then when I see that, I'm like, well, their autism is something, and it does kind of like is emergent as like a really hard experience for individuals. It is a disability, but I get what you're saying. It's. I'd be interested to talk about it more.
Okay, we have about 5 more minutes and we have 4 questioners. And I think what we typically do at this point is have everyone ask the question and then you answer whatever you choose. I believe in the back row, you.
Thank you. This was really interesting.
Oh,
Yeah. Something that I was thinking about is, so no, I guess sociologically, sometimes we don't think of like embodied traits, or embodied categories existing outside of the categorization itself, right?
Mhm.
There weren't any indigenous people in the Americas until like 1492. And so I was trying to think through like what is the value, if any, of thinking of autism as existing outside of the diagnosis, right? Like, what does it mean for there to be people who are autistic who've never been diagnosed or perceived by themselves or such? And yeah, I was wondering whether you could think through that. That's true.
okay. Next question, Joran.
Yeah, super fascinating. Thank you. I'm just wondering if you can speculate a little on the kind of social role of these self-diagnosed internet.
Yeah.
Any thoughts?
Next question, Rebecca.
Yeah, thanks for this great talk, very thought-provoking. Kind of in line with your question, like, why the obsession with making this a diagnostic category, not just a description of benign human variation in a rigid system where we have to sit in a row? Like, if resting bitch face is included, like, I guess I should go to the doctor. So,
Well, that's you know it, and at the same time, sorry, I don't. Can I respond?
Let's go, Christina. Christina, did you have a question?
Katrina.
Katrina.
That's okay. Yeah, I think it's kind of similar to maybe Rebecca's question and Grace's question and part of Santiago's, but the quote of like, it doesn't fit our definition of autism, so, but it's nevertheless autistic. Like that was really interesting to me, right? So that it made me think about the spectrum and how we choose to like lump or split a spectrum of behavior. So I guess like their questions plus the kind of like lumping and splitting, and maybe sort of, could you speak to like how this fits with maybe like a genealogical approach to thinking about mental health?
Okay.
And like the emergence of the categories, and like, do these conditions exist as real kinds outside of the diagnosis?
and sorry, can I just say one, like to just add on? We had a word for the bullying, it's bullying. So like, why do we need the word autistic to address the thing of bullying?
Well, and I think like, and I think the real question is like, are we describing a real differentiation and embodied experience of humans? And I think the answer is yeah. And like one of the tricky parts of doing this type of presentation is that there are profoundly disabled autistic individuals. Any individual person that is spiky right here and is unable to talk or is nonverbal is going to be immediately labeled as low functioning autistic despite anything else going on. Because it's an extremely visible form of disability that people are able to experience. Whereas someone that's like, oh, able to save themselves, be emotionally explosive until they get home in front of their significant other, that's hidden. But it's still very detrimental to their own experience. It may very well be something that's worth like, oh, well, until I looked at myself through an autism lens, I never understood that about myself. I wouldn't necessarily describe it as disabling. You certainly could still find work, but it'd still be an like sensory sensitivities get all sorts of into this, like individuals that are expected to wear an uncomfortable uniform at work and quit the job because they don't want to anymore. That's something that's oftentimes described by autistic people. But this idea of like, well, that's not really like, yeah, that's an embodied experience. It's not really a disability. All the person needs to do is wear the comfy clothes they want to wear. When put into the conditions that that's no longer an option, things fall apart. And that's why I like that. Like no one's autistic until things fall apart. And like until things start going poorly or yeah. And so I am not at all saying like making this argument like this disability does not exist. This diagnostic category is absolutely necessary. And I didn't include a ton of it, but there's some really interesting sociological accounts of more what would be described as profoundly disabled autistic or visibly disabled autistic individuals. But just also this acknowledgement that it is a spectrum. And yeah, like maybe the assumption would be there are enormous populations of individuals that may very well experience some of these that by, showing this, description of human attributes may, if not describe themselves as autistic, be more empathetic to the autistic experience of these being much more extreme kind of embodied experiences. Yeah, I don't know. Is that getting at anything, Rebecca?
Yeah, I guess, yeah, my question just kind of remains, why do we have to make it a medical, biological category? And why wouldn't it just be diversity of types of people? Like, the fact that this medical puts it back into the body, makes it biological, lets Elon say he's above people, but also lets us try to remove those genetic markers from the population or something. So
Yeah.
I just
Well-
sociologically concerned about the biologicalization of this form of difference.
Because the psychiatrists also already doing this stuff. So
And it's interesting. The professionalization of it all is interesting. Like this, like, oh, professional authority, yes, it's expanded. Yeah, I think that so like Elon like essentially it's like leading to some sort of like biological essentialism or like that's not my intention of the argument I'm trying to make. And in some ways, I'm trying to respond against that. I think there's large groups of individuals who have felt stigmatized for their own embodied experiences. And once they found like a positive way of framing it, have latched onto that positive framing and been like, oh, I'm not all the labels that I was called as a child. I'm Asperger's, and also like there's like and then it like takes on this form of like supremacy, like not like those other autistic people. I have Asperger's, and this is kind of the more expansive way of describing it in terms of like why does this diagnosis exist? Like if you've ever met, an elementary school kid with what would be called now executive dysfunction, you'll understand why these types of interventions exist. It is not hard to spot an autistic kid in a classroom that is not doing well. And is not able to function well in that class. That's why it's called executive dysfunction. They're not functioning. So like once you get it, and my wife's been a fifth grade teacher for 15 years and we've talked about this a lot. And over the years, we've had all sorts of conversations about like students she's had that are diagnosed with autism. But it becomes really necessary to be able to have that recognition and then also get into occupational. And then now we're getting into like the gatekeeping professionalization of it all. But like to get occupational therapy, to get and not ABA. So like ABA was the like train it out of them, like the like treat. I don't know. The criticism would be like behavioral, treat them like a dog, like train the behaviors out of them. The difference between that and occupational therapy is like, oh no, how do you work with the abilities you have, etc. I don't. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Right.
I think it's more than.
Oh, good.